Okay, part 3, Race, the Constitution, and Public Policy. So you can see this is a chunk of pages, so 143 to 155, and this is going to be a little bit of a longer video just because there's a lot in it. So couple important things. Again, you should be taking just making a list of court cases as you're going through and you're reading, because there are more than that are, just the top 15 must knows. I will be asking you about some of these others, as you probably saw on your chapter 4 quiz. I asked you about one and I did go over it in a video. So do write these down. I recommend flashcards just because there's a lot. All right, so just to get started, African Americans have been the most visible minority group in the United States, and the civil rights laws that African American groups pushed for have also benefited members of other groups. 3 eras define African American struggle for equality in the Americas. So the era of slavery, the era of Reconstruction and resegregation from the end of the Civil War until 1954, and then the era of civil rights, which is from 1954 to the present. The delegates of the Constitutional Convention did their best to avoid facing the divergence between slavery and the principles of the Declaration of Independence. You recall? Yeah, the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Oopsies. Okay, during the slavery era, any public policy of the slave states or federal government had to accommodate the property interests of slave owners. Okay, keep in mind with the Constitution, prior to the Constitution, with the Articles of Confederation, that the country was just a loose friendship working together when it benefited them. They had some things in common, but it was very, very loose. And so at that point, it was nearly impossible to try to do anything to regulate slavery. And again, most colonies had slavery at that time. It, of course, more minimal in the North, but it was there. And with the Constitution, a lot of the most powerful men, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, all were slave owners, right, among many others, because Virginia was such a powerful state within the young country. And so you're not going to get a lot of movement on that. Of the first 5 presidents of the United States, only John Adams was not a slave owner, and in fact, very few of the founding fathers group did not have some connection to slavery. Even good old Alexander Hamilton, while not a slave owner himself, his father-in-law was a slave owner in New York, and of course, Alexander Hamilton was born down in the Caribbean, where slavery was an everyday part of life. So he wasn't, and he did not actually own slaves himself, but just that connection, right? It's there. It's just it was part of their kind of lives. So you're not going to get a whole lot of freedom for African Americans at that time. So with the and again, the property interest, I think that's a really important point. We just need to remember, as hard as it is, that enslaved Africans were considered property, not people. And so these are considered property rights. They had fought a war with England over, representation, over property, and amongst other things. And so that was going to be a really hard shift at that time. So as we in the era of slavery, one of the big court cases was Scott versus Sanford, and we see the end of slavery with the 13th Amendment itself. So this, of course, is right after the Civil War. And after the Civil War ended, Congress imposed strict conditions on the former Confederate states before they could be readmitted to the Union. So if you remember, that was radical Reconstruction. Many African American men held state and federal offices during the 10 years following the war. Reconstruction is going to end in 1876 with the Hayes election of Rutherford B. Hayes. So Reconstruction will end then. As soon as they regained control following Reconstruction, white Southerners imposed a code of Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws are segregation laws. They are laws that really range from public use facilities, separate schools, all the way to customary rules such as casting your eyes down when you are walking down the street and encounter a white person. So all really arranged the whole gamut of daily life. All right. Now, there was some limited progress made in the first half of the 20th century. During this period, segregation was legally required in the South. So we call that de jure segregation. And in the North, so I mentioned this earlier, in the North, it was called de facto. And de facto was just more like it was allowed, it wasn't by law. The Supreme Court provided constitutional justification for segregation in Plessy versus Ferguson, which was in 1896. And Plessy versus Ferguson is a really big case because it is going to create what is known as the, well, I've got it, your book has it listed here, equal but separate. I don't know why it did that. I made this a Google Doc from a PDF, so I wonder if it was spaced weird. Separate but equal. I'm going to rephrase it because we don't call it equal but separate, so that was weird. Sorry about that. All right, sometimes it converts weird from a PDF. So Plessy is really important because of that purpose. I'm missing this too. All right, and so separate but equal doctrine. Now, Plessy is not one of the 15th Supreme Court cases you must know. But I think the reason for that is because Brown versus Board of Education is one, and it's going to overturn Plessy. So you kind of do have to know Plessy to really understand Brown. So the Supreme Court decision in Brown, that was in 1954, and that marks the beginning of the era of civil rights. So a lot of times we think we kind of jump ahead to the 60s, all the chaos of the 60s, but civil rights is going to really start to take off in the 1950s. So Brown versus Board of Education was a landmark decision because the court held that school segregation was inherently unconstitutional because it violated the 14th Amendment's guarantees of equal protection. You might want to jot that down because we are going to look at Brown a little bit, in more depth. But there you go. You've got a little bit of a head start on that. The modern civil rights movement began in 1955 when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in the front of a Montgomery, Alabama bus where only whites were permitted to sit. The boycott that followed her arrest is often seen as the beginning of African American civil rights movement. We have sit-ins, marches, and civil disobedience as key strategies during the civil rights movement. Um, and then again, I talked about this earlier, but we refer to it as a movement because that's what it was. Rosa Parks was not just tired one day and decided to not get up from her seat and give up her seat. This was a planned thing. And in fact, interestingly enough, was a young girl who actually was arrested before Rosa Parks. And what's sad is, I love history. I can't think of her name. She was a 16-year-old girl and she was pregnant and not married. And the civil rights movement, the leaders said, you know what, she's not going to be the one that we're going to take a stand behind because her character can be essentially assassinated. Where Rosa Parks had a really good, character. Her background was really quote unquote clean, like she, was a hardworking lady, and people would be more sympathetic towards her. So it's kind of interesting. Again, this is a movement planned out, thought out, and rehearsed, and a lot of work and self-sacrifice. So the Civil Rights Act is going to kind of be it's going to be a huge part of the civil rights movement. It's not going to be the culminating, effect of this. We'll get to that in a little bit later. But it made racial discrimination illegal in places of accommodation and in employment. So that's going to include hotels, motels, restaurants, other places of public accommodation. The act also forbade many forms of job discrimination, and Congress cut off federal aid to schools that remained segregated. So that school desegregation was a huge, huge part in all of this as well. And hopefully you remember about the Little Rock Nine and Central High and those brave kids. All right, so getting and using the right to vote. So when we talk about, getting this really important suffrage. So suffrage was guaranteed to African Americans by the 15th Amendment. That didn't come around until 1870. So again, the Civil War is going to end in 64. amendments are not easy to pass. Southern practices to deny African American suffrage, such as literacy tests, the grandfather clause, poll taxes, and the white primary, were struck down by the Supreme Court, and the 24th Amendment upheld that even further. In 1964 is when that was passed. So just to kind of go back over that just a little bit. So 15th Amendment in 1870 guaranteed African Americans the right to vote. But a really important thing to recall about that, though, is that implementation of the right to vote of suffrage did not occur for over 100 more years till the 1960s, right? And that is because Southerners found a way to manipulate the system through things like the literacy test, the grandfather clause. So if one of your grandparents had been enslaved, then you couldn't vote. Poll taxes, so that is having to pay to vote. Okay, and so that was a pretty big deal. And then white primaries, only that was in chapter 4, so only white people could vote in those early elections, and you could only have, in some cases, white candidates as well, depending on. Texas was the main state, I believe, if I remember correctly, that used those white primaries. All right, so the 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. They prohibited poll taxes, so no longer do you have to pay to vote. And the Voting Rights Act, that's going to be just this capstone. It prohibited any government from using voting procedures that denied a person the vote on the basis of race or color. So poll taxes were prohibited, and poll taxes in state elections were invalidated by the Supreme Court 2 years later in a case known as Harper versus Virginia State Board of Elections. So the 24th Amendment was a little narrow, and it was prohibiting them in federal elections. So they had to have another case. They probably argued the 24th Amendment set the precedent. And in Harper versus Virginia State Board of Elections, that was passed on to state elections. One thing, just historic thing about this, was when President Lyndon Johnson spoke in front of Congress about the Voting Rights Act, he made a really great speech, in my opinion. Just yeah, of course, they have help from speechwriters, but one of the things he did in that speech was he used the phrase "we shall overcome," and that is from, of course, important civil rights song. And so by using that, historians, you see these talking heads talk about how important that was as a signal, like, this is going to get done. Like, we're going to get this done. We are a part of this movement. And he made himself be a part of that. And Johnson is such an interesting guy because he is from Texas and Southern Democrat. And he was, of course, paired with John F. Kennedy, the Boston Democrat. He was JFK was rich, and Lyndon Johnson was not. He actually grew up, pretty lower middle class. He was actually a school teacher out in West Texas. Many of his students were Mexican American, first generation, second generation. And that made a huge impact on him. And as a teacher, I can understand that as well. Just the impact students make on you. And he didn't just really help this Voting Rights Act, but also his war on poverty was another huge thing. And a lot of our programs like Head Start and Medicare and programs to help groups that are in lower income brackets to, just help them, just to help them have a standard of living. Those came from Johnson's administration. And just one more note, I know I'm going on, but Johnson was a young congressman when Franklin Roosevelt was the president, and Johnson loved Roosevelt. He idolized him. And so that was of course, in the 30s during Franklin Roosevelt's first term. And then Johnson was in the House for a bit and then moved into the Senate. I believe he was a Senate majority leader or minority leader at one time. He had some party leadership, but he's a really interesting guy. He also pulled some crazy stunts, and he had 2 beagles that everyone in his family had the initials LBJ. So it's kind of a fun story. All right, getting back to this though. You guys know I do love my history, but we're doing Gov, so gotta keep on here. And one thing to keep in mind is that, of course, other minority groups are going to be a part of the civil rights movement a little bit later on, as the African Americans movement really will kind of start things off really strong and get some traction. And let me indent these really quick. So, one thing to keep in mind is American Indians, Native Americans, they also fought for a more equal status. Um, I'm just looking here. And of course, the Native Americans have had, another long-standing history with the American government, a lot of promises that were not upheld. And so that was really a really difficult thing. Hispanic Americans, mostly, in California and U.S. history, even we do talk about the Chicano movement and Cesar Chavez, kind of not, I don't want to say following in Martin Luther King's footsteps, because he did have his own, of course, personality and his own needs, and he was working for farm labor. But he did enact a nonviolent resistance as well. He also did hunger strikes like Gandhi. He did pass away a pretty young man, I believe he's in his 50s or early 60s, but relatively young. In part, I believe, due to some lasting complications from the hunger strikes and whatnot. But so there's that. And then Asian Americans. So one of the big civil rights issues that Asian Americans, of course, faced was the internment during World War II. And that was passed with Executive Order 9066 by Franklin Roosevelt. And the way that was written and why it was upheld, it was because it created a military zone. And the military zone, was part of the war effort. So they said, yes, you can eliminate certain people from a military zone. And in this case, Japan had just bombed America with Pearl Harbor. And so that's how they got away with that. And of course, Fred Korematsu was an American citizen, as were thousands and thousands and thousands of those who were interned. And in the 90s, President Clinton did acknowledge Korematsu himself. He gave him Presidential Medal of Freedom, but then they also did. I think it was under Reagan. They did give some back payments, because, of course, one of the big things is these people, not only were they imprisoned, but they had to sell all their property, and they could only take what they could carry. And I just think about, we're so close to the Bay Area, and how many of these people would be gazillionaires with the price of their homes these days. So there's this huge generational impact as well. And a lot of Japanese Americans were also in the floral industry, which was huge market. And so their farmland they had to sell it, give it away for pennies on the dollar, because otherwise it would just have been taken from them while they were interned. No one had any idea how long that would have been. So, and then under other groups, your book makes this point that, after 9/11, we've seen discrimination towards Muslim Americans and people of Arabic descent, and some Middle Eastern descent. So your book gives a stat, but your book is old, but it says more than 1.2 million persons of Arab industry in the United States. So we'll assume that number is going to be a little bit bigger. But definitely members of these groups of Middle Eastern descent have been victims of increased numbers of bias-related assaults, threats, vandalism, and arson. And then, just kind of just reminds me, going back to Asian Americans, right now in the news, you hear these stories about Asian Americans here in California, across the country, being attacked because of the COVID virus, so coronavirus, and how it was given blame for China for it. And so that's just kind of another thing that just stuck out to me as I was just giving you guys this little info on 9/11. So something to think about is that the events of the day can really affect how people are treated, in our country. Things that they have it's no fault of their own or anything like that. So, okay, so I'm going to stop there. I know I went on a little bit. Go U.S. history, I love it, but hopefully that was helpful.